Welcome. My name is David Elwood. I'm the dean here at the Harvard Kennedy School, and I'm especially glad to have you here on this for what is a terrific topic and a great conference. And so I'm pleased that you can join us. I'm also, by the way, pleased that my wife is here, and if you will excuse a proud father, my daughter Melinda, who's a lawyer and legal aid up in Portland, Maine, is driven down along with her partner Sarah Shaw. So thank you for being here, and I'm happy to have you. But I also think this is an amazingly important time, amazingly important topic. I really do think the topic tonight is more than a marriage, the LGBT movement at a crossroads. But I almost think of it as being on the knife edge, where one can imagine going one of two different ways. There are many reasons to be optimistic right now. When you look and see what's happened in marriage in some places, there's real hopes for progress in don't ask, don't tell. And most importantly, perhaps, the polls of young people and their attitudes and so forth. But there are equally good reasons to be really fearful that that progress will be reversed even, and certainly slowed. And we've seen the referendum process has not been particularly kind to this movement. And there are many, many other reasons that you will be more able to mention than I to be concerned. And so I think this is really an especially important time to be thinking about what the future holds, what are the issues, what are the strategy and tactics and politics and every other dimension. So I want to just thank all the people that were a part of this, putting this all together. So the Kennedy School LGBT Caucus and its co-chairs, Sam Lee and Liz Terry, as well as Sarah Bouchette, Eric Gregory, Tommy Shang, Paige Ennis, and in the degree programs office, Judy Kugel, Melissa Wojciechowski, Debbie Isaacson, and especially Tim McCarthy here, who's in the Carr Center for Human Rights, who has supported all this. So I will say no more, since you have much wiser people than I do, but thank you for coming out on a lovely Friday evening in spring. It's a real testament both to the spectacular speakers we have and to your commitment. So thank you very much, and let me turn it over to Tim.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David, very much for being here, and the whole Elwood family for being here. We're very happy and honored you're here. And thank you all for coming. I should also just thank Shannon Minter, who just gave a remarkable Papadopoulos lecture to an eager and anticipatory crowd. So thank you so much for those wonderful remarks. This is the conference plenary, where the topic for today is More Than Marriage, the LGBT movement at a crossroads. And it's interesting, I'm a historian, so I'm always looking for these moments when movements, I'm a movement historian, so I'm always interested when these movements kind of take stock of themselves. And I think that right now the LGBT movement is really taking stock of itself. The Creating Change conference in Dallas that just took place was a buzz with people sort of saying, where are we and where are we going and where do we come from? I think obviously some of this has to do with the fact that last year was the 40th anniversary of Stonewall, which is the sort of the origin moment for the modern LGBT movement. And then also I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that we have just had a shift in administrations, presidential administrations, and a shift in political power in Washington at a time, and I think David's right, where we've made enormous progress, but yet there is great uncertainty and I think a fair amount of anxiety. And so I think this is a time to take stock. And tonight we have a remarkable group of people here, homegrown in many ways. One thing that all four of these folks have in common is they've all been the marshal for the Boston Pride Parade at some point in their lives. Last night I was with Sarah Shulman and Helen Molesworth, and they were both out 100 people of the year. I told everyone I was 101, which is actually not true. And now I'm in the midst of, now I'm the out guy again here. I've never been the marshal in a parade, but that's okay. Anyway, someday we can all dream. This is, when we were thinking about putting together this closing plenary, we thought about, all the sort of people who are out there who could speak to this topic and take stock of where the movement is. And one of the things that I realized in planning this is that we have remarkable people right here in our neighborhood. And all four of the folks folks tonight are people who are homegrown and work and operate in some ways out of Cambridge and Boston, and so it's wonderful to have you all here. And I'd just like to say, for those of you who are coming back, is to Cambridge and Boston. Boston and Cambridge, well, whatever. Is to welcome home and welcome to the Kennedy School. I'm going to introduce each of these folks very, very briefly. They all have stunning resumes and long bios, which I've edited down. I'm going to introduce them very quickly. I've given them 4 big areas where we're going to kind of address some specific issues, and I'll get into that in a minute, and then we'll open it up for the Q&A. Sue Hyde, to my immediate right, is a seasoned community leader, organizer, and advocate whose issues portfolio as one of the iconic leaders of the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force includes literally every LGBT issue imaginable, and then a whole range of social justice issues even beyond that. Sue serves as the director since 1994 of the National Conference on LGBT Equality, Creating Change, and that conference is the country's national conference on LGBT equality that gathers over 2,000 activists, organizers, and leaders of our social change movement. I should say that I was, until this year, a Creating Change virgin, and I am no longer. In June 2007, Beacon Press published Sue's book on LGBT organizing, Come Out and Win, How to Organize Yourself, Your Community, and Your World, which is a path-breaking book about organizing in the movement. To her right is Jarrett Barrios, who began his tenure as the president of the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, GLAAD, this past September. Barrios is known for his work as a human rights advocate and former state legislator here in Massachusetts, and is proud of his role as a husband and father of 2 teenage sons. Under Barrios' leadership, GLAAD advocates for full equality for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community, and challenges discrimination not necessarily in the realm of politics and the courts, but in the broader culture of television and media and faith institutions, sports and entertainment, and more. Barrios joined GLAAD after serving 9 years in the Massachusetts State Legislature and 2.5 years advocating for access to care and coverage for residents of Massachusetts as the president of Blue Cross Blue Shield of Massachusetts Foundation. When he was an undergraduate here at Harvard, he was the president of the BGLSA, which became the BGLTSA and is now the QSA, Queer Students and Allies. He was recognized as Legislator of the Year by organizations as diverse as Massachusetts Immigrant and Refugee Advocacy Coalition, the Disabled American Veterans, Metropolitan Area Planning Council, and Massachusetts Senior Action Council. And his son is here somewhere. Sorry. He may be here. This is so funny that everyone here is to my right. That is often the case, although probably not actually the case tonight. To the right of Jarrett is Reverend Irene Monroe, who lives in Cambridge and is coordinator of the African American Roundtable of the Center for Lesbian and Gay Studies in Religion and Ministry at the Pacific School of Religion. She is a Huffington Post blogger and a syndicated religion columnist. As a native of Brooklyn, Reverend Irene Monroe is a graduate of Wellesley College and Union Theological Seminary at Columbia University, and has served as a pastor of an African American congregation before becoming a Ford Fellow at the Harvard Divinity School, pursuing her doctoral degree. She's a syndicated queer religion columnist, and her columns appear in 43 states and in the UK. She has been profiled in Oprah's magazine and also featured in the film For the Bible Tells Me So, and she sits on advisory boards of many LGBT organizations. And finally, but not last but not least, is Gunnar Scott, who just got here rushing from a grant deadline, and I'm very grateful for Gunnar's participation and getting here so quickly. Is a founding member, the executive director of the Massachusetts Transgender Political Coalition. Gunnar has been involved with the transgender rights movement since 1998. He's a nationally recognized activist, educator, and community organizer on LGBT health issues, LGBT partner abuse, and addressing access issues for the transgender community. He has written widely, and his Agitate and Activate essay, which is the introduction to Pinned Down by Pronouns, a 2003 Lambda Literary Nominee anthology published by Conviction Books. And Gunnar holds a BA in Liberal Arts from Goddard College, where he completed an oral history project titled Boston Area Transgender Community Leaders and the Enda Crisis. And like all of the other panelists, has a whole list of awards and achievements that I will pass over now in the interest of getting to the task at hand, which is more than marriage, the LGBT movement at a crossroads. The first thing I want to ask of the panel, and I'm asking each of you to speak for around 5 minutes about this, is that it's pretty remarkable to think of the actual successes that have come out, the achievements and the triumphs that have come out of the movement, which really is a movement that's relatively young, if you think about things historically and in the longer view of history, which I tend to try to do. And so I'd like for each of you to reflect for a couple of minutes on what you think the sort of major successes or success is of the LGBT movement in its modern incarnation, and what you think is the biggest challenge right now moving forward where we stand. Sue?
You're not going to use your
Oh, that's right. I'm doing my batting order. You're right. I gave them a batting order.
I am a lesbian softball coach.
Well, then I'll stick to my batting order. Jarrett, you will be first, and then Sue, you will be second. Jarrett, go ahead.
I'm not. Can you all hear? Okay. All right. Get this right. So what is our greatest successes and failures? Well, first of all, it's a delight to be here. One thing Tim didn't say in the introductions was I was his FUP leader. FUP leader.
He was the first gay person I ever met at Harvard.
I was, indeed, indeed. And so just jumping right in, what are the biggest successes and challenges? I think that, for me at least, in understanding the work of GLAAD, we do culture change, social change work. The belief being that we will never be fully equal unless and until society accepts, respects, and values our contributions, and equality follows from that. So our challenge, our belief is that beyond, after coming out, which is perhaps the most significant way to change people around you when they understand somebody who they love and care about is gay, perhaps the second most way to be impactful is to expose folks, particularly folks who don't think they know somebody who's gay or lesbian, through the media, to LGBT images, storylines, news items, etc. And so we work to advocate in that space. So perhaps with that as a background, it's not surprising, I'm Cuban, I talk very fast, I'm sorry. It's not surprising that I think the most important change that we have seen is the huge shift in public opinion in favor, not just young people, but young people in particular. Dean Elwood, Professor Elwood, do you have a preference?
Fine, yeah.
All right. As Dave mentioned, but in general, we did a poll at the beginning of last year, 2009, called the Pulse of Equality Poll, where Harris Interactive, a noted polling firm, kind of asked, basically the question was, over the last 5 years, have you become more supportive, less supportive, or the same on kind of your beliefs and understandings and support for LGBT people and issues? And a full 20% of America, or 19%, indicated they are now more supportive. That's a fifth of the population in 5 years self-reporting as being more supportive. There is, I don't know if any other civil rights movement in such a short period of time. Now 5 years may feel like a long time, at least it did when I was 20 and running the BGLSA, but it's not that long in sort of the scheme, the timeline of social movements. And when people were asked why, the biggest reason was, for them, self-reported, were getting to know and know about gay folks, lesbian folks, bisexual folks, and transgender folks, not realizing, going from invisible to visible. And that story, I guess, broke down into 3 parts. One was the coming out, but then the other piece was hearing, seeing, learning through media news about LGBT folks. In the old days, they never covered us. Now they do. And the third was seeing it in kind of cultural places. So television shows like Glee and Modern Family, which tell stories. And a lot of us laugh and dismiss, what's more important is don't ask, don't tell. It's more important to talk about endo. And legal change. But legal change follows. It's not an accident that young people are more supportive. It all goes back to Pedro de Mora in, was it 91 or 92, in The Real World, the first real sort of storyline, honest storyline of a real person openly gay on television, a show targeted to young people, 18 to 28 or whatever. Very, very important, and I think perhaps the most important success. Our biggest challenge, legal equality. We are in virtually every way second-class citizens or third-class citizens in this country. And I think you just have to look at Washington, D.C. and the ridiculous debate about don't ask, don't tell, which 80% of the American public supports the repeal of. With a Democratic president and a Democratic House and a Democratic Senate, we are still sitting around debating. Pathetic.
Sue.
Tim, So, very important success happened early in our movement, and I have a special door prize for the person who can first name it. And I'm going to disqualify just a couple of people from participation. So Sarah Schulman, disqualified. And Jeff Perotti, you're out of this game. And Shannon Minter, no. And Robbie, no. Okay, so who can name what happened in 1973? No, nobody on the panel.
We should be disqualified.
You are all disqualified.
Yeah.
Anybody else name what happened in 1973? Yes.
Well,
Wrong
yeah,
here, very important.
Very important.
Is that when Elaine Noble was elected?
Very important, not it. This is something that affects every queer person on the planet, probably, but certainly in the United States.
Is that when it was removed from the DSM?
Here's your T-shirt! So Susan, take the rubber band off and wave it around.
Cool. Look at that. Oh, it's small. It's really little.
Oh, it's a medium.
That's awesome. Howard sexy.
Howard sexy.
Congratulations and thank you. In 1973, the American Psychiatric Association declassified homosexuality as a mental illness. But other remarks on successes. Our movement lives and breathes and organizes in every state in this country. In fact, in every major city and some cities that aren't so major. We engage lawmakers, policymakers, opinion makers at every level of government, but actually most importantly in state legislatures. Here's a former state legislator right here. Senator Barrios.
Campaign director for Pearl Street.
Yes, I was. We've learned the tough political lessons that elected leaders who support us must be in turn supported by us. We now know that we must stand with and for not only our full equality, but also we must work with those who stand with us and support us. Government exists on multiple levels: federal, state, county, municipal, and even in some cities at the neighborhood level. None of our friends can be taken for granted. No politically elected leader who joins us in the struggle can be ignored, and no public agency can ever be assumed to be doing the right thing. Another lesson learned not quite so well is this: political reform and social change arises from the bottom of the political food chain, not from the top. Our local elected officials rise to state legislative seats. Our state legislators rise to the offices of state governors and the U.S. Congress, and our members of Congress and our governors often run for the office of President of the United States. The positive relationships that we make today with the members of city councils and school boards are positive relationships that we will enjoy and benefit from for years to come. Our elected officials at lower levels of government must always be part and parcel of our overall and famous gay agenda to change the world so that none of us ever faces prosecution, persecution, or punishment for living our lives as openly lesbian, gay, and bisexual and transgender people. Now the challenge: to turn from domestic concerns to the matter of oppression of homosexuality and non-conforming gender identities of sisters and brothers living in other places and spaces. Our challenge today, this day, is this: we must stop the export of a lethal animosity towards LGBT people to other countries, and we must effectively support the growth of LGBT movements in other countries. Many of us know that the Parliament of Uganda has before it legislation that would not only increase criminal penalties for homosexuality and HIV-positive status, but also mete out the death penalty for crimes of being unrepentantly lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender, or HIV positive. The Ugandan Kill the Gays bill is sponsored by a member of Parliament who attended and was greatly won over by a crew of nefarious US-based right-wing fundamentalist homophobes. The notorious Scott Lively, author of The Pink Swastika, the screed that charges that the Nazi leadership was rife with homicidal homosexuals and therefore launched the Holocaust, led the charge in Uganda at a conference there in the spring of 2009. In his presentation, he delivered defamations, vilifications, slanders, and lies about queer people and cultures, and stirred up a venomous hate campaign against LGBT people in that country. But he also called out LGBT people from Europe, whom he accused of brainwashing young Ugandans to become gay. Lively bragged that he had dropped the nuclear bomb of homo hate in Uganda. No kidding. The most vociferous and deadly purveyors of homo hate in the U.S. have run out of track in this country, actually. They are marginalized. And Scott Lively and his organization is on the Southern Poverty Law Center list of hate organizations here in the U.S. But they're now hard at work in Central and Southern Africa to ensure the codification of medieval and Inquisition-like punishments for the free expression of same-gender loving and gender nonconformance. The U.S. State Department has lately turned up the heat on the government of Uganda, and that is needed and welcomed. But a grassroots movement to expose and stop the exportation of virulent homophobia has actually yet to materialize. It would be a great service to all the world if the U.S. LGBT movement would prioritize in a more significant way a campaign to hobble, muffle, and disable the international juggernaut to nurture, aid, and abet homophobia around the globe, and concurrently to foster and support LGBT activism in every country on this planet. Right on? Yes, sister.
I'm just going to apologize from the outset. I've been on a 3-day activist bender. I haven't really slept because if you live here in Massachusetts, you might know we have a little trans bill that is kind of exploding right now, which is very exciting. So I was receiving phone calls from the folks at the Republican convention last Saturday about the bathroom bill flyer being handed around, and that's pretty much how my week has been. So I would say I'm going to speak from purely transgender perspective because I think we have enough folks to talk about gay and lesbian. And I will talk a little bit about my perspective as well, but for thinking about the trans movement, I think our greatest achievement is that we have a trans movement that is separate from the gay and lesbian movement. Not to say that we want to be away from you all, but that we are gaining our own voice. And in the last 10 years or so that I've been doing this work, we've gone from one organization that's been around for 30 years here in Massachusetts called the International Foundation for Gender Education to approximately 25 state or large city trans political groups around the country. And out of those 25, 4 of us have some funding and staff. And we have one large national organization that does advocacy work, the National Center for Transgender Equality. So just seeing that in the last 10 years is amazing to me, having done this work for as long as I have. And I think the other piece that was a success was the rise up of lesbian, gay, bi allies around the 2000 ENDA crisis, as I call it, when we were kicked out, when gender identity was removed. And just, I will say, as someone who has worked on trying to get trans people into ENDA and being kind of ignored for a number of years, to see, as I was shocked to see that many people sign on to say, no, we will not support legislation without trans people. I never thought I would see that, much like I didn't think we'd see marriage. So I'm a trans person, I have really low expectations in general. I will say, I think what's a challenge for us moving forward is that trans folks are still not integrated into the larger LGBT movement. That I still get hate mail from people identifying lesbian, gay, that I'm throwing off their movement, that I'm making a mess of things. Tell those trans people to sit down and be quiet. I mean, we were just kind of thrown off the bus by the Montana Republicans this past week. They said, oh, we have marriage, and that makes the Republican candidates okay, they support that. But trans people, screw you. So, you know, I think that that's still a problem when the community that I call my community as a queer trans person is not accepting of me as a whole person. it's difficult. And then when I also have to kind of bring along my straight trans folks and say, these are the people that are going to help advocate for us, and they're experiencing transphobia from folks, it's really difficult. So, you know, we're still waiting to see what happens with ENDA. I feel pretty confident that we'll stay in this time. But it's a shaky platform sometimes. You know, I think having the hate crimes bill pass with both sexual orientation and gender identity was a huge success. As problematic as hate crimes are, but the fact that that's in a federal piece of legislation that I can point to when I talk to legislators now and say, look, Congress did this. I don't understand why Massachusetts legislators can't do this. You know, it's a huge step forward for us. So I want to stop there.
Okay. I should just mention, Jarrett is live tweeting from this. He's not doing work. Irene?
Like Gunnar, I'm going to talk about a particular group within the LGBT movement, and that's what we call our queer religious. And I have to say, I want to acknowledge a colleague of mine that I have to say, I have not seen her in 21 years. When we were students at Union Theological Seminary, and that's Lucinda, so I'm very glad to see you here. And also know that I'm not the only religious queer person in the house. So, this is just wonderful. But let me talk a little bit about that. 21 years ago, it really dates us, does it not? But 21 years ago, when we were in seminary, I felt like I had to be closeted about my faith more than I had to be closeted about being a lesbian. Because to be a queer religious person, as we would say back in the day, really posed a lot of questions about your sincerity about the LGBT movement. Because we saw religion to be such a hindrance, you know, in terms of moving forward, we were always suspect as a particular subgroup within the movement. But we saw something in 2004. Although we say that we are a nation that have a separation between church and state, we clearly saw with Bush, with Baby Bush, that he blurred the lines on that issue. And one of the things we got to see is how religion-based bigotry, in many ways, won him the election. And how, as liberals, whether we were queer or straight, really did not have a comeback rhetoric to counter or tamp down the vitriol, the religious vitriol that they were using. But a lot has happened since my years in seminary, and even a lot has happened even since Bush's era, in that we have seen a movement within the LGBT movement where you have open and affirming mainline denominations. You also have queer denominations, you know, like Dignity, Metropolitan Community Church. You also have black queer denominations. That is an amen moment. There's some black folks up in here, say amen. Just say amen. Anyway, that's an amen moment. We have Unity Fellowship. Well, that is a struggle. That's a struggle and continues to be a struggle. So that truly is. But what you've also seen in mainline denominations like the Human Rights Campaign, as well as Task Force, Soul Force, that's the director, the former director is Mel White, and Faith in America, where Mitchell Goh is the director of that, that you see that in these mainline national organizations, you will see a religious advisory board, understanding the importance that religion plays in discrimination around what we call state and city and national issues. So that's been a wonderful sort of success. However, let me just tell you a little bit. We've also countered the Exodus movement. These are sort of your reparative therapy, I wouldn't say treatments, but bogus organizations that say that they can make a person straight again. We've seen that. The black church has been a little different in that what we've seen in terms of the escalation of the mega church, we've also seen the escalation of black reparative therapy groups, which is unfortunate. But the big thing here, the biggest success is that we have cracked a door that was clearly, as we'd say, if you go back to 1973, and even if you go back again to the 80s, those of us that were queer religious were highly suspect. So, and then to see within particularly the Episcopal Church, that was another amen moment. It's a moment that makes me believe there's a God somewhere. And in that moment, it's opening and affirming of LGBT folks, but more importantly, the consecration, which I was so delighted to witness, Bishop Gene Robinson. So it was really wonderful, to be quite honest, that when I would watch CNN or Fox News, to see Gene Robinson be that religious spokesperson, that have the kind of religious authority to talk about the role religion plays, you know, in political life of Americans. So that is certainly one of our success. Our challenges is always, how do you move the movable middle? How do you use the very thing that has solidified their belief that LGBT people are abomination? How do you come up with a different sort of religious discourse that opens them up to see how they may have viewed what they viewed about us within a religious context is deeply flawed. Similarly, the way in which religion was used to sanction and legitimize slavery in this country. But while people, I will say, on a good moment in white America will understand that racism is a sin and a crime, they still have not moved forward. And that's that movable middle. I have learned this much as a pastor. There's some people you just can't change. But there is a huge movable middle, and a lot of that really has come from members in their family who've come out. Believe it or not, the issue of same-sex marriage has changed folks in many ways around that. I think if you could move Dick Cheney a bit, chances are you could move a world. And it's got a lot to do with the fact that his daughter is gay. And when it came to should his daughter and family receive less benefits than the rest of America, I think you have to think twice about that. So as more and more of us come out, issues like, hopefully don't ask, don't tell, but certainly same-sex marriage and other important issues that we're faced with, people will begin to change. So the challenge is that as we come out, we have to continue to know that the bigotry of religion still plays in the minds of folks even when they go to vote. So that's it.
Great. So moving from the state of the movement to strategies and tactics, we're all talking about marriage. Everybody's talking about marriage, gay marriage. Even people who oppose it, people who are ambivalent about it, people who embrace it. We had a session last night with Sarah Schulman, Helen Molesworth, and I, each in very different places on the marriage issue, talking about it. And Sarah had to say, are we going to talk about marriage all night, or are we going to move on to other things like art? And so we did. We moved on to other things like art, and then porn, too, for a moment. But anyway, then human rights, because you always get to human rights through marriage and porn. Marriage equality is the big issue, dominates the public imagination on a whole range of LGBT issues. And yet there are many ways in which many more ways in which LGBT folks are still a source of anxiety and disgust, are still the target of hatred and discrimination in a whole range of arenas. And I'm wondering if you all could address for a moment whether or not the issue of whether or not the movement has made a strategic mistake by focusing issue by issue, and in particular on marriage, changing laws and policies first, as opposed to changing what Jarrett talked about, this sort of culture change, broader changes of hearts and minds. And every movement has to make that navigation, or have to navigate that territory between the kind of political and legal work of movements and the cultural work that movements do. And so I wonder if we've gotten ourselves stuck in what I like to call a celebrity death match between court cases and ballot initiatives. And then a follow-up to that, too, is something I'm interested in. Have we abandoned our radical roots, the movement's radical liberationist roots, in favor of a more issue-by-issue based, incrementalist, and perhaps even assimilationist agenda? Sue?
Oh, I'm up to bat.
You're up to bat.
Okay, all right. So, Professor McCarthy, You have raised an interesting question about the balance between political progress and social and cultural change. So first I want to note that political organizations or organizations with political missions will pursue political goals, period. It would be irresponsible, for example, for the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force to fail to deploy much needed resources and talents to our sisters and brothers in Maine, right? When they face the people's veto of marriage reform legislation. We won't turn away from political struggles in which we have an important role to play. But having said that, there is much good work to be done to extend the nascently exuberant cultural and social welcome of LGBT people. The project of changing hearts and minds is certainly assisted by political organizing and activity, or goes hand in hand with it. So when an advocate and a community member knocks on our doors to ask support for the Inclusive Employment Non-Discrimination Act, some very fruitful and important persuasive discussions can follow, or perhaps the door will be slammed in somebody's face. And when Massachusetts recognizes the rights of same-sex couples to marry, the 18,000 weddings that follow reverberate, of course, through the wedding services industry, but actually also through workplaces and families and neighborhoods and houses of worship and schools. Ellen DeGeneres is the most well-known lesbian advocate in the country, and perhaps in the history of the world, and that's all good. But we have not yet mounted that expansive and far-reaching campaign to educate, persuade, and convince most Americans that homosexuals and transgender people are, well, harmless to their families. And we are harmless. But asking the unconvinced to cast aside the stereotypes of rapacious and uncontrolled, unconstrained homosexual lust that they view as predatory is our next big thing. Now, as for those radical roots, I hold a personal aspiration that this state, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, can become the best place in the country to live, cradle to grave, a natural lifespan, by the way, as openly LGBT people. Claiming our freedoms is one part of a very radical notion, but so is taking our rightful places in civic discourse at every level. That, too, is another step of a very radical dream. My good friend Susan Shepard, who's one half of the first same-sex couple in Massachusetts to be issued a license to marry, remarked sardonically, "Hey, this is really cool. Gay marriage is the new fuck you." But getting from fuck you to how can queer people help make our communities better places for everybody is exceedingly radical. And I am down with that. Hi.
Marriage. Well, I want to answer the marriage question. I'm so sick of marriage, honestly. I will say, from a local perspective, marriage kind of put the timeline off for trans rights here in Massachusetts. And that, you know, is a typical kind of trajectory for trans issues. We saw that happen in New Hampshire. Possibly was going to happen in New York. We think we have a state that's ready to move forward on trans issues. Marriage starts popping up, and that becomes the focus. That's where the money goes. From my perspective here, we think about the money that was poured into the state for marriage. In no way have we received that for the trans rights bill. In no way. And I think that's pretty much happens. As far as being radical, I think that what's radical is for us to connect with other movements. You know, when I think about the work that I'm doing, I'm on the phone with a mom who's Brazilian, whose son is trans and is dealing with a high school that's being awful. And, you know, I call her back to give her some advice and some support and some information. And then she says, well, his friend, who's also a Brazilian young girl, who's not trans, who's not queer, is also having the same problem when you talk to her dad. And I said, sure. So I'm the trans organization helping this Brazilian family deal with this school system that is being racist and homophobic and transphobic, and that's just what I do. you know, and how do we get our whole movement to see that it's not us and them, that we are them, they are us, that my folks that I work with are dealing with economic issues and immigration issues and all other issues, and they're all wrapped up, and we can't not work on all of them. And I think what has been difficult is to see the funding, the money go into one area, and that's it. And when we're not making those connections, we're not being good neighbors. So why should those other communities support us? You know, so I, you know, question those who have power and privilege and their own motives. They're the ones who are directing this movement. You know, as someone who gets very little money, I get to do what I want. There's some, you know, great things about not having anything. You can pretty much do what you want with what little you have. So, you know, I think that becomes part of this in thinking about. As far as, you know, we think about incrementalism, assimilationism, I sometimes think about, you know, what can we do to make the biggest impact for the most number of people? And sometimes it is incrementalism, and sometimes it's not. And sometimes incrementalism is used to stop including all of us. And that is what I think happened with ENDA in 2007. We're going to do incrementalism. We'll get gay rights first, and we'll come back for trans people. Well, it's been 21 years here in Massachusetts, and trans people, we're still waiting since the sexual orientation rights passed. And that's, you know, that's problematic as well.
I agree with you. Well, I got to tell you a story. So in May of 2004, when marriage was legal here in the state, you know, being a minister, I described that moment, marriage mania. Couples, and I can't tell you the number of couples from that time on that I've married, but particularly in the month of May. So some couples would come, and of course you have to do the obligatory, so why do you want to get married, when did you meet your partner, or whatever. And one couple, and the parents looked rather disgusted. One couple, and I'll tell you why. One couple came and they said, well, we met at a club just 2 weeks ago, and we're madly in love. And I said, and do you know anything about the person? And she said, well, no, but we're going to discover. And of course the mother's eyes is rolling back like, oh God, another, you know, and I just turned to her, and I think the mother thought I was going to say, no, you need to think about it. And I turned to her and I said, listen, this marriage ain't but for a minute, but come on up in here. You can't screw it up any worse than heterosexuals. Come on, child. And I did. And the mother looked at me like, oh, what kind of reverend is she? But nonetheless, I really felt that way. But and indeed, you know, I ran into him. Listen, it's so funny because I hadn't seen him, and folks will come and say, you know, you married me, and I said, oh yeah, and I happened to run into them, about 6 months later, and they said, well, how you girls doing? I just can't stand her. I just can't stand her. And, you know, so it's just amazing. But the point is that I just say that to say that, you know, this is where I feel about marriage equality. I never thought that I would be in this particular fight, but I do feel, I don't feel, it is our birthright. That's number one. The bigger problem is that when we talk about marriage equality, we begin to see the fault lines of race, class, gender, as well as religion. The framing of the debate is really a problem of the larger queer, white, privileged community. When we see marriage as a privilege, and it's framed that way, as opposed to our rights as American citizens, that's part of the problem. I'll give you an example. So right here in the People's Republic of Cambridge, I did the invocation for that night's event. Cambridge wanted to be the first to issue marriage license. You were there. I think you were there.
Girl, I was there.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we were all there. Right?
I wasn't even there.
Okay, right, okay.
I was in North Carolina.
Okay, that's all right. But anyway, the very interesting thing is...
Marshalling a pride parade.
Yeah. But leading up to that, there had been an enormous amount of, dissension particularly between the black community, and it's not just with the African American ministers, but it was with the black queer community. And part of it had to do with the way in which the dominant white community appropriates and pimp black folks. So here was Cambridge, and they realized, oh my God, we need some faces of color. Well, first of all, there are not that many faces of queer color, well, of color in Cambridge in general, than of queer couples, right? So all of a sudden they say, get Irene and Thea. Okay, that's my partner here, back there, Thea. We've been together for 15 years, right? And so, and the very interesting thing is that, and the point about it is, did they call me or Thea about how might we frame this debate? And the point about it is neither of us are closeted. So the problem is the way in which the framing of that debate that then had also a national kind of replication of the way in which they situate black people, people of color, or insert them to promulgate their agenda. That's the problem. It's not about all of us, because the framing of it really, in many ways, is that you do want to protect your family. If you talk about saving your family, black folks in particularly would get on that bandwagon, largely because within the African American community, many of us anyway, whether we're straight or gay, married or not, are taking care of our sisters' children. We're taking care of somebody's children other than just our own. So the framing of that debate raised a lot of problems. I'll give you another example of that, Proposition 8. I get a call from my friend Sylvia Rue, who is the religious advisor for the National Black Justice Coalition. That's the only black queer organization in the country. Sylvia calls me up and she says, Irene, you won't believe what's happened here with Proposition 8. And I said, well, what happened? And she said, well, they're saying that the reason why it was passed, it wasn't repealed, is because of black folks. And I said, well, is that right? And I said, well, since when has California, become a black state? Now, I can guess to find out that it's only 8% of the population. But the problem with that, and of course they expected two things. Of course, many more black folks came out simply because Obama was on the ballot. But they had to remember a couple of things, that black folks, like Mormons, like the Catholic, voted along religious lines. That it brought out the conservative vote. And black folks voted just like everybody else did. I'm not excusing it, I'm just trying to contextualize why this happened. But another reason why it also happened is because the planners felt that when you have Ellen, and you have Melissa Etheridge, and when you have Wanda Sykes, and when you have, Hollywood, that they had Hollywood and money, they didn't need to do the community organizing in the black community and communities of color, to get the vote, to get the kind of outcome that they want. So as long as they think that they can just rest on money and white privilege, my thing is, don't call me to promulgate your agenda. That's it.
Jarrett?
I want to start by disagreeing with your premise about marriage. And that's, well, I absolutely agree with it at the state level in what we would call blue states in the United States. Marriage is very much sucking out the oxygen, except in those states now where we have marriage. I think at the federal level, it's just the opposite. I think that federal legislators can't run fast enough in the question of marriage. And it's ENDA and don't ask, don't tell, and it's those two things, and it really sucks the oxygen out of everything else. And that's sort of the nature of politics. You're sort of told that you're allowed so much, and you, in the incremental way of change, you choose what's there, what's moving, and you try to get it, and there's not a whole lot left. Which I guess brings me to Gunner's point, and his point really about, I think you can make it broader than your statement. I mean, about how frustrating it is that you have to wait. There's a lot that you have to wait for. And I will say that I think the answer to that is, having served 9 years in elected politics, it ain't elected politics. It ain't the legislature. That you change the underlying sort of framework, and it follows. I want to share a couple of quick stories. I'm a storyteller too. So we just, at GLAAD, we just challenged a film. I know there's some artists in the room, and we occasionally get called censors at GLAAD. We're not. We, though, believe it's important to oppose things which promulgate stereotypes and which we believe hurt communities that we defend. One of those, there's a film recently at the Tribeca Film Festival which glamorized, it is our belief, hate crimes against transgender women. And we, along with a number of transgender organizations, opposed the film. And I can't tell you the amount of, I mean, this is like, you're going to nod your head because this is not news to you, but the amount of hate mail from gay men that we got who don't get the difference between a drag queen and someone who's transgender. Transgender women.
Sometimes there isn't a difference.
And sometimes there isn't, but sometimes there is. And that somehow it's all funny that these folks are getting bloody, you're murdered, and that it's humor. It was surprising to me. And I guess what I took away from that, Donna, was exactly your point, that in a certain way we're not, there's no such thing as the LGBT community. We have, at some points in time, different interests, and in this case, very much, it's something of a fiction to assume that we're all in the same place. So what does that mean for the purpose of your question? It means that we've got some work to do, because you can't assume, you know, e.g. ENDA with HRC, we can't assume that we're all just, we've got each other's backs, right? A lot of folks assume that the transgender community was part of it, and then we woke up one day and they weren't the bill. I think the same is the case as Reverend Monroe cited. She cited the African American story in Prop 8. I'll tell you the Latino story in Prop 8. So there were $40 million spent in California by our side to defeat Proposition 8. 20% of the electorate, 20% of people that voted that November were Hispanic. Guess how much money was spent researching messages to persuade Latinos to vote no on Prop 8. This is sort of to your point about investing as opposed to blaming later. In doing the work that you're doing in the majority community, guess how much money out of the $40 million? $0 was spent. Not a penny was spent. And then now, 2 weeks before the election, after the other side started doing ads in Spanish, we did our ad in English. They literally got somebody I know who works at Google and is a linguist, but not Hispanic, to translate the English ad into Spanish, and they got the Ugly Betty cast, who of course everybody likes Ugly Betty, right? Well, no, actually, 50-year-old Latino women don't know what the hell Ugly Betty is because it's in English, right? They don't watch it. So then they only kind of commented on that after November 5th or 6th. Why didn't they vote for us? And it's that sort of assumption that we're all on the same way and that we're all, that I guess was a lesson learned. Now, what does that have to do with marriage? I mean, this is about marriage. I guess what I'm saying is you got to do, whatever your issue is, you got to do your homework. You got to do your grassroots work. And part of the grassroots work is the culture change work and recognizing that different communities, you can't take them for granted because maybe they're voting for Obama, right? But that doesn't mean they're voting for us. And we have to have strategies that include them in our educational effort, that at least for those who are in the movable middle, that we invest to persuade them and hopefully successfully do so. And certainly don't complain if we don't after the fact.
Well, this leads perfectly into the third sort of issue I wanted to raise, which is coalition building, right? I think the movement, we use the word movement and community all the time, right? We're the LGBT movement, we're the LGBT community, and I've heard several times today, and I've made this claim before, that when, in fact, those are both kind of creative fictions, or Shannon Minter actually said that the LGBT community is an aspiration. I actually loved that line in the Papadopoulos lecture. But we are still, one of the other things that he said was that we spend a lot of time talking about how we can form a community, how we do aspire to that together. We spend a lot of time criticizing each other, we spend a lot of time talking to each other, and wrestling with this idea of how do we build a coalition within the movement. And I'm wondering, though, how this problem of coalition building, how we wrestle with this problem of coalition building moving forward. And I'm not just talking about coalitions within the movement, the different interests of the L's, the B's, the G's, and the T's, and all of the different ways that they're segmented and diverse. But also, how do we build stronger coalitions to other social justice movements, to people who are straight allies, who could be moved to join our cause and be out for us. We had a panel earlier today on allies here at the Kennedy School. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that sort of problem of coalition building to move away from what I think is really an insularity in the movement. it's historically produced for good reason, right? LGBT people have been under siege for much of the history of the modern movement, right? And so there's the insularity of the movement, the turning inward and relying on each other, has been wonderful in some ways, but in other ways has, I think, been very detrimental to the movement moving forward. So how do we wrestle with this coalition building problem? Gunnar, we'll start with you.
I mean, I think the first thing is you show up.
Yeah.
I mean, I honestly, the last couple of years, being at MTBC, and then prior to that I was with another GLBT organization, and I spent a lot of time at other people's stuff that wasn't LGBT.
Yeah.
And right now, I'm the LGBT organization that people call that are doing immigration work or, you know, labor work, and I'm all of them, and I'm the trans person for the trans organization. But they're like, oh, we know you, you're all the queer things. So I've got to now speak for the LGBT. Luckily, I've been all the letters at some point, so I can speak to all of them. But I just spend more time on one of the others. It's true.
The personal is the political.
It's true. But, you know, it's not always expecting those folks to show up at our stuff. You know, like, why, it shouldn't be a one-way street. I think that's the first piece. And then I think the other piece of why it's difficult, you know, is that when we do show up at other people's stuff, then we got to deal with their homophobia, their biphobia, and their transphobia. Yeah. And so you got to put on your flak jacket, and you got to kind of also deal with it. And you know, and that can be hard too. You know, when I think about, you know, I send a lot of our members to different stuff because I'm one person and I can't be everywhere, although I'm trying to clone myself. You know, I've got to prep them and say, you know what, this is what this group is like, this is, you know, this is the person to watch out for, and like giving people that kind of information before they walk into the door sometimes. So that's part of it, and also just making those connections, you know, and I think we need to talk more about economic issues, healthcare issues, and broader issues, and not just always put it into marriage and don't ask, don't tell.
It's always an LGBT thing.
Right. Yeah. And so how do we speak to all those communities and all those issues, and not just our own? And that's where we need to do that work. And sometimes we just need to eat and dance together too.
Yeah.
And part of that gets a little dicey because, you know, what I've seen here in Massachusetts as someone who is also a queer arts promoter and ran an open mic for a long time, and I do dance nights and all this stuff, is that we've lost a lot of queer spaces here in Boston for queer people. Because, you know, it's like, oh, you know, it's you know, queer folks show up at the Milky Way and there's straight people there, and it's great. But sometimes you just want to be in queer space because you want to make sure the person you're hitting on is okay with you hitting on them, you know, and sometimes you guess, so we've also lost some of that too in our assimilationism of our own queer spaces. But it's showing up at other people's stuff and being helpful and not always making our issues the #1 issue.
Irene?
I want to talk about it on two levels. I have to tell a story.
Okay.
Yeah, ministers tell stories.
I know.
And lies. Okay. But in any event, I want to go back to 1969, June of 1969. I was a kid living in Brooklyn. I wasn't even in high school. And the news had hit the community. And back in the day, we called the cops the pigs. This is still part of the civil rights movement, with the tail end of the civil rights movement. And racial tension is still very hot. Not to say that it has dissipated today in this quote post-racial era, but nonetheless, it was very, very hot. And people took their anger and frustration and protest to the streets. And so I'll always remember that hot day of June in 1969. We got the news that there was a riot going on down in the Village. Many of us kids had never heard of such a place called the Village because we were 10, 11, 12, 13 years old. But what we had heard was that that Antoine in my community, Antoine was the music director of our church on Sunday. And we knew the boy was gay. He was flamboyantly gay, so as many of the other boys in the choir loft. And the black church always sort of beat to what I call a black queer gospel aesthetic. And in any event, we had heard that the cops are down in the Village beating up on Antoine and a number of other folks that we knew. And so a whole bunch of us kids, you know, jumped the turnstile and went down to the Village and ended up in this place this bar, and that bar, outside the bar is a place called Stonewall. And so before I knew it, here I am in the riot. And was there, and of course, you know, down with the pigs. And I knew nothing. I didn't know I was gay at that time. It's sort of like down with the pigs, right? And we were throwing bottles, we were cussing, doing all sorts of things. But see, being there is very, very different than what the story, the history of it. The Stonewall bar was a working class black and Latino bar. And if you remember back in the day, it's pretty much like today. It was segregated. And that the reason why that bar got hit more by the police than the other white gay bars, and it's not to say that those bars did not get hit, is because they didn't have the money to pay the cops the way the white bars did. And so this was what I call, we've missed a movement moment. And the reason why I say that is because if we didn't bleach out the folks that fought that night, which were black and Latino and dykes, were trans people, were people of color, were poor people, we had the interconnection of issues and justice that needed to be done. But when the iconic face of the movement is Matthew Shepard, and you don't have Rita Hester, who died here a decade ago, and you don't have the black, you know, the Latino, the Puerto Rican trans, you know, man that was killed a couple of months ago, then you do yourself a disservice. You've shot yourself, you know, in the foot. So the big issue is that you have to, we want to do coalition building. We want it. Now, I know everybody knows. We got to do something. We got to do coalition building. But the point is, and a lot of them will reach out now to people of color. That's why I'm sitting here on this panel here, because you done reached out to Irene. Okay. And I've always said, you know, if I'm going to be a token, I'm going to take it for a good ride. So be with me for a moment. Okay. So the point is, though, the issue here is that, so the point is, there are two things that I offer. One is that you have to deconstruct whiteness. I don't care what class you are, you have to deconstruct whiteness. I want you to leave here pondering two questions, okay? And I will not wax ebonically, okay? Two questions. One is, how are you white, and how white are you, okay? And if you can answer those questions, and they're important questions. I mean, how are you white, clearly, because you got white privilege. How white are you? I'm just basically asking you, when did you get your white card? Nell Painter, a former professor, black professor at Harvard, wrote a bestseller. It's going to be. It was reviewed in the New York Times. Talks about, I'm asking, when did you get your ethnic card? Really. And the reason for that is because by losing that history of struggle, your people's history, is why you appropriate everybody else's history. Okay? And also it makes you dangerous, even in the good justice work that you want to do in terms of coalition building. But I can go on and talk about that, but that's one thing I want to leave. That's the work, that's the homework that you have to do. The other work that you have to do is this, and that's part of also deconstructing your whiteness, but we have to move to action. When the AIDS epidemic was rampant in the community, it was said long before, and this is actually, Lucinda, when we were in seminary, back in that day, I saw, because at that point I was pastoring an African-American church in the Bronx, we knew long before the CDC did that black straight women were HIV positive. You saw your sister friends die. And so what happened is that once the queer community, white queer community, no longer said this is an issue here, they had framed the whole campaign that served their community. A lot of brothers would say they didn't feel even comfortable going down to the Fenway. But that when you sort of distance yourself from an ongoing struggle that can be an inroad into a community, then you've lost, again, a movement moment. So the point is that AIDS is still going on. You still can go and grab that moment and build some trust and some inroads, because it is ravishing our community and stuff. So I leave you with two things. I leave you with a thought about go home and do your homework and an action piece. So
good.
That's it.
Jarrett?
He's too busy tweeting.
No, I'm just telling everybody what she's saying. There's a lot of people following us on Twitter right now.
Excellent. Well, there it is.
GLAAD is sort of where I work every day. One of the things that were surprising to me when I started, because I'm bilingual and bicultural, was how little actually the majority community sort of even follows what goes on in Spanish. And that language difference actually has political importance. I'll give you another story. About 3 weeks ago, the well-known singer Ricky Martin came out. And people laugh, ha ha ha. You know, one-day news story in English. And then a lot of people, mostly men, said, oh, we all knew he was gay, right? Well, it may have been a one-day story in English. It was a 3 weeks and counting story in Spanish language media. It is still news. Now, why is that? That's because there was never Ellen DeGeneres in Spanish. There was never Rosie O'Donnell in Spanish. There was never anyone of a celebrity, public, elected, actor, whoever, to come out before at that level, at that sort of degree of celebrity. And it didn't hurt that the guy actually has 2 kids. People have known him since he was 13 in Menudo, and had a profoundly impactful discussion. I have a young man who we were all young once. He was young when I was his mentor in 1996, when he was at Northeastern Law School, and I was at a big law firm downtown in Boston. And I had coffee with him last week. He's in Chicago, and we're doing some focus groups in Chicago. And we sat down, and he never used to talk about his family. What he would tell me about his family was, well, they know I'm gay. And that was about all he would ever say. And so he said, Jarrett, the funniest thing happened this week. My mother and I, we never talk about it. We never talked about it since the day I came out in 1992. And I said, yeah. And she called me last week, and she wanted to ask me about my life. I said, yeah. I said, well, but she's never wanted to ask me before about my boyfriends, about what I do, about anything. She's never said the word gay since in the 18 years I've been out to her. I said, well, what happened? And she goes, you know what she said to me? She said, did you read about Ricky Martin? And it's funny, but it gave her the space and the confidence to ask something that she's never had the guts to do before, the courage to sort of make that moment. And everybody else in English sort of makes light of it, like big friggin' deal. But what's the lesson there? I guess the lesson is that, and it's not just Spanish-English. It's, that one day soon, actually May 5th, there's a very major country star who's going to be coming out, a woman. And when she comes out, it's going to resonate in places like Kansas and Tennessee, or maybe Ellen hasn't, because people listen to country music, and there's going to be discussion. 2 weeks ago, a Christian rock, that's not an oxymoron, is it? A Christian rock, I'm not sure if that's how a Christian musician.
Christian rock star.
Christian, is it rock?
That was the
Yes, there is.
It is rock.
Yes.
I don't listen.
It doesn't come with the role, though. It's Christian.
Christian music star came out. And in an important way, for those folks for whom she has touched with her music, it's starting an internal discussion. And for some, they'll never buy her record again. But for others, it will open them to who we are. Because it's someone they know and care about and have followed. And that's not to say it's all about celebrity. But it's similar to when somebody you love comes out. If somebody you care about and or know of and care about starts that conversation. So my point simply with this in terms of the coalition building is a lot of times it doesn't start with the politics, right? It starts with appreciating and respecting, and I'm just in humor of Christian rock because I'm actually not sure if that's a category, but it starts by, I think, respecting and building bridges across whether it's our artistic, our cultural, our linguistic differences, and respecting that different cultural moments in the LGBT space actually have impact in different areas. And where you do that, you don't then get the Ugly Betty cast and make them do an ad in Spanish where they have gringo accents in Spanish and think it's actually going to make a difference in how people vote, right? Because you've taken seriously the difference.
I love, though, that you now have, get the advanced memo about who's going to come out as a celebrity now in your new role. And, I love it. I love it. Yeah.
So Jarrett, in relation to Christian rock, don't forget, upon this rock I will build my church. All right. Is it Dolly Parton? Oh, so disappointed.
Reba McEntire.
We're not. Oh, we can hold up this whole.
Bonnie Raitt.
I want it to be Dolly Parton. So there are two aspects of alliance building that LGBT people have failed to grasp, and in particular white and privileged LGBT people. Many of us presume and assume that our contemporary struggle is the most important and only important social justice struggle underway in this country. After all, we are the butt end of the political body. We are oppressed in every aspect of life. We are relatively less powerful in political arenas. We are attacked and killed on the streets for sport and to make men feel big. We are constantly used and abused and exploited by all manner of opportunists looking to score political points. Geez, we are in a really bad way. But let's smell some coffee. The right-wing echo machine, lately called the teabaggers, always call them the teabaggers, call them the Tea Party. Isn't that right?
Oh,
the
I always
baggers, I'm on message, baby. So the right-wing echo machine populates itself with political targets aplenty. Immigrants and abortion rights advocates and low-income people and women generally and especially powerful women particularly. People of any color other than white and people of any religion but Christian. We got lots and lots of company in the crosshairs, and we've made impressive alliances with many advocacy organizations that speak on behalf and work on behalf of these other targets. But on the ground and in the grassroots, as Gunnar does, we can be much more attentive to and responsive to calls for help from our colleagues in other social justice movements. The steps are simple. Step up and listen, show up and help, speak up when appropriate, and otherwise shut up. Social justice movements are about good relationships, and so let's make more. Secondly, LGBT people assume incorrectly sometimes that people who don't know us don't want to know us. We live in our queer bubbles, whether it's geographically or in our own heads. We think that most straight identified people have swallowed every lie about us, hook, line, and sinker, and it makes us afraid and it makes us shy. As the fabulous lesbian singer and songwriter Joan Armatrading once wrote, mistaken shyness can be costly. So, we lose opportunities to engage neighbors and co-workers and even family members when we assume ill will on their part rather than assuming good faith as human beings. So, we can reach across some gaps and we can say hello. And sure, somebody might slap us down. But I think most people actually will be interested and curious and will welcome a simple hello and a mutual conversation.
Great, thank you, Sue. Thank you. I have one other question that I was going to ask folks because I'm getting asked this question all the time, and if we could just very quickly run through this down the line about what we do with the president, who is and was and is enormously promising in a whole range of ways. I think. I'm very frustrated by the folks who are so quick to throw him under the bus after a very difficult, and in some ways, when you think about it historically, with a long view, a quite remarkable first year of the presidency, notwithstanding the frustrations on particular LGBT issues. And so I wanted to sort of run down quickly, and then we'll open it up for the Q&A. What do we do with the president? Did we have false hopes? Do we give him more time? How do we deal with this? Because it's something that we get asked all the time, and then I think we need to.
Oh, am I?
I had you up for it.
Oh, okay. I have the answer.
Yeah, of course.
course, of course. You know, it's interesting. Obama certainly is someone that we've hung our hopes and aspirations on, and he was supposed to be the game changer. But I got to see some sort of unfortunate moments about his political aspirations, I would say. When let me just say this: I wrote an article. Actually, I wrote it, and it'll appear in the Advocate and it's called Obama's Homophobic Ministers. I got to see a side of him that I was just very, very dismayed by. It certainly started when he was doing his gospel tour in the South, trying to get evangelical votes, particularly black evangelical votes. And he caught it down in Clerkland, and everybody know that boy is gay. And so, in the Chitlin circuit, and I have to tell you, if it's on the Chitlin circuit, it's better than Jet, Ebony, and the New York Times. And so the point is that we knew, you know, and the funny thing about it is that he continued to court when he wanted to get the black evangelical vote, black homophobic ministers. But I think the consummate moment for me, the culminating moment for me was the inauguration, because it was like, okay, you won now, enough of this. We understand the strategy here. And what he did was, for the inauguration, I really felt like I really felt that we were thrown under the bus. He had Rick Warren do the inauguration prayer. And so to pacify us, he had Bishop Gene Robinson do something the day before. And be that as it may, glitches as they come, we did not hear Gene Robinson's prayer, invocation, but clearly 2 minutes after he finished, it went on, what is it, CNN or whatever? HBO. It went on HBO. So one of the things I think we have to do here is that I think we don't present ourselves as a cohesive group too, so he can exploit that. Yeah. But let me just give you one strategy point, particularly you got to find your allies. And so one ally that we certainly have, I think that those of us in the African American community, certainly working with the National Black Justice Coalition and a few other organizations and key people in our community, is that we really tap the folks in the political black caucus, because they very much are LGBT friendly, such as Julian Bond, John Lewis, Maxine Waters, and that's right, and the NAACP. So I think at this point, the only way to move him on these issues is to find allies and stuff, because we're not cohesive enough. We really aren't. We're not clear enough. And in many ways, it doesn't matter whether he gets it. And I've learned this really as a pastor. I'm not concerned about changing the hearts and minds of people. I've heard you say that, Sue, and maybe we should switch roles here. I'm about changing the behavior of people, and with the hopes that with the behavior change, a salvation moment will come, a redemptive moment will come, and your heart and your mind will change. But if not, I have laws in the books that will protect you from discriminating against me. And that's an amen moment for me.
Sure.
Sure. My thoughts are pretty simple. I don't care if you're a Democrat or a Republican, if you're liberal or conservative. It is our responsibility to push our gay agenda as vociferously, as diligently, as committedly, no matter who you are in the White House. I personally have not been at all surprised by President Obama. As candidate Obama, he wasn't particularly friendly to the LGBT community, and there were many moments in which that was visible, but many people chose to look the other way. And even if he was friendly, we would still need to push and push and push. And now is the time to push. We've got two things that are possible in the hopper this year with Don't Ask, Don't Tell. It's repeal, and with the passage of a trans-inclusive ENDA. And I think we owe it to all of us owe it to ourselves to push that. I don't think we're going to get anything from this administration without pushing. So,
Professor McCarthy, I wrote him a letter. Can I read it?
Sure, yeah.
It won't take very long.
You wrote him a letter, right?
My dear, dear, dear Mr. President. I love that you, I'm going to pretend he's right there. I love that you, a black man who is smart and wise, is my president. Most especially because I grew up in a small Illinois town that until the mid-1950s posted signs at the edge of town that read, Nigger, don't let the sun set on you here. Beardstown, Illinois was a place where you not only wouldn't get a hotel room in the bad old days, but you wouldn't get to get lunch either. So you, Mr. President, may be our country's first gay president. No, I don't expect you to come out of the closet, and if you did, I'd actually be a little disappointed because you and Michelle are the hottest couple ever. But if Sasha or Malia came to you and said, Dad, I think my body really isn't right for me. I think I really might be a boy inside. You would hug your child and you would help her through her journey to selfhood. Mr. President, you are so gay, but we're having some problems. And I'd like to bring some realities to your attention. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people have been in the political wilderness for 28 years. No, let me make that 58 years when the Mattachine Society was founded in 1952. In fact, let's talk about millennia of oppression. But okay, I'll keep it to my lifetime. For my entire life, we have struggled to make our lives more livable by ensuring specific reforms in federal law and policies. And some progress has been made, but much remains to be done. And you, Mr. President, have made a generous promise to repeal this year the heinous military policy of don't ask, don't tell. And now comes the news, just yesterday, that your Deputy Chief of Staff, Jim Messina, has advised us that you're not so keen on DA-DT repeal this year after all. So what options do we have, sir, but to chain ourselves to your gate and to appeal for your mercy and ask for your help? What can we do but holler at you while you are raising funds for our good friend, Senator Barbara Boxer? How can we move you to keep this promise? We know not, but we will try every play in the political playbook. Agitating, lobbying, organizing, demonstrating, sending postcards and emails, making phone calls, and yelling at you in public. We will do all that we can do to persuade you that you must stop discharges today, and that you must use your political capital to press the Congress to repeal this miserable law. But Mr. President, are you listening? Your door is open, as we see when many of our fine gay leaders meet with your administrative staff. The door is open and conversations are underway, but you need now to exercise your political will, which we have seen was powerfully used to win health care reform, and which we see is powerfully used now to win financial system reform. Sir, you have been busy. It's simple, Mr. President, and it's hard at the same time, because we're not the coolest kids in the class. When you've been shit on for thousands of years, you do tend to stink a little bit, and we are needy. We've got lots of needs, Mr. President. Given that political wilderness thing I mentioned a little bit ago, I haven't even included passage of the Inclusive Employment Non-Discrimination Act, or repeal of the Defense of Marriage Act, or the enactment of the Safe Schools Improvement Act and the Student Non-Discrimination Act, or comprehensive immigration reform that includes the Uniting American Families Act and the DREAM Act. Yes, sir. I know you have opened government-funded hospitals to our partners if we are sick and dying. Yes, sir. I know your folks are working on opening the doors to low-income housing for LGBT people who are low-income, and I appreciate that, and I'm glad you've appointed so many lesbian, gay, bisexual, and I'll be darned, even transgender people to important jobs. That's all good, sir. Even if I may say so, that is so gay! But after waiting my whole life for full equality under the law, I notice I am impatient. I feel upset with you, Mr. President. I voted for you. I made phone calls for you. And my girlfriend even gave you money to run for the White House. She has more than I do. I want your leadership, Mr. President. I want your fierce advocacy. I want what I have been waiting for my entire life. I want to be like you, a fully vested and valued member of our national community. I look forward to your quick response with much respect and love. Sue Hyde.
All right, Sue. That was so unfair. I'm going to go in a different direction. I actually just want to ask our community, where were you during the Bush years?
Yeah.
Where were you yelling at him? I know some people did that.
Yeah.
But frankly, I'm a little annoyed. I'm like, so why weren't we changing ourselves to the White House back then? Why weren't we doing some of these things? I will say that he did, I sometimes say, what promises did he make? I don't remember them. I didn't get that memo, I don't think. But I am impressed with the policy changes. I'm impressed that when I go to the National Center for Transgender Equality Policy Conference and the government is falling all over themselves to present to trans people, I'm like, really? We're going to hear from TSA, we're going to hear from the president's office, we're going to, there was so many of them that we were like, it's like 6, can we go now? I don't want to hear anymore. That is, pretty amazing to me. The fact that, right out there, first step, no discrimination on sexual orientation and gender identity. Before, at the office of the president-elect. That was, as a trans person, it was huge. I work with a lot of young folks. I share an office with the Boston Alliance of LGBT Youth, so I'm surrounded by youth all the time. And when, they saw that, and they're just like, the president likes us. The president likes us. So I think sometimes we have to think about what does that message say, that bigger message. And remember, often we get mad at the people that are trying to do something for us faster, louder, more furious than the people that are really standing on top of us and trying to crush us to the ground. Like, when were we doing that time? I chained myself to shit. I remember that.
Yeah. Okay, we have, thank you for that final point. We have time for a couple of questions. We actually have a reception in the Malkin Penthouse immediately following this, so we can continue this conversation. But let's open it up for a couple of questions from the audience. If you could identify yourself and ask a question, in particular, identify a panelist that you'd like to ask the question of, that'd be great. Questions? Someone's got a question. Yes?
Oh, that's one. I'm a gay person. I run an international human rights organization, Physicians for Human Rights. And it seems to me that there's not a connection or assimilation among LGBTQ organizations and other human rights organizations or broader human rights organizations, if that's a fair expression. And I'm wondering the impact, or could there be a greater impact if there was more connection? When I think of, for example, letters that are signed to the president or anyone else, I never see a gay organization or an LGBTQ organization on those letters, signing on letters. I see lots of other human rights organizations or advocacy organizations. And I'm wondering, would there be more power in the voice if there was sort of broadening the community or the neighborhood, as some would say?
Are you talking about international human rights
No, I'm talking,
letters?
well, you mentioned Uganda. There's 12 nations where you get the death sentence if you happen to be an LGBT person. And I think there's a connection that it doesn't have to be international, it's also here. That, huge human rights organizations are engaged in justice here. But it doesn't seem to me that organizations that focus on our issues become keenly involved in those organizations, that we care as much about their causes as they care about ours, and vice versa, and what power we would have if we were all more engaged with that work as well.
Are you assuming that there are no gay people on the boards of those organizations?
No, I'm just saying, no, not at all. I'm not assuming that at all. If I run one, I'm assuming there are. What I'm saying is that our voices, if we're part of Amnesty, you're part of Human Rights Watch, and our work is a connection to all those organizations, we multiply our impact tenfold. And I don't see at a national, international level many LGBT organizations signing on to those letters. There seems to be a distinction, I guess I'm saying, between human rights organizations and other
LGBT
organizations.
Right.
Well, I
Sue,
think historically there has been a failure failure on both sides in our movement, in our thinking about and articulating about who we are in a context of oppressions. We ourselves have not necessarily made the connection from LGBT civil rights to human rights. And I think on the part of large human rights organizations, although I believe this is changing, there was a period of time when the concerns of LGBT people were not particularly noted or recognized by large human rights organizations. Now, having said that, I want to say that Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, to name two, Southern Poverty Law Center, certainly the ACLU, which is not, I wouldn't characterize it as a human rights organization, but it's certainly a civil liberties organization. But particularly those four, and there are others I'm not thinking of, have in the last, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International in the last 15 years have both launched specific projects related to lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people. Not only offshore, as we like to say here in the United States, which means anywhere else except our most important country in the universe. Not only offshore, but actually, Amnesty of all time, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have both issued reports about the treatment of LGBT people in the United States. And our State Department has recently begun to examine in a more careful way the treatment of LGBT people in other countries, and is beginning to develop strategies to bring the pressure that they can to bear on other governments. And they have actually been not quickly enough, but somewhat impressively active around the situation in Uganda. Although I fear that something much greater will need to be done in respect to that. So, I mean, those are my thoughts on it, and it's not actually, international human rights is not an area of work that I do, so I'm not going to claim any great knowledge.
I'd like to, as the executive director of a national LGBT organization, I've never actually been approached about signing on, and I certainly would be open to it.
I mean, I think the voice of GLAAD in Uganda would have been powerful.
Well, the voice of, actually GLAAD was deeply involved. If you read about the story, let me explain to you, because we actually were quite involved. I have a religion, faith, and values director, and Craig, who was very involved. When the organization in Somerville, the anti-right wing Political Research Associates, did a report. They partnered with GLAAD. This was the report that first made the connections between Reverend Rick Warren and what's it called, the table or the family or the brotherhood or whatever the heck it is. It's like a Da Vinci Code or something. When that report was the first connection, GLAAD partnered with Political Research Associates, because we're media advocates and we call the media on, and in this case, on all religion-based things. That's what this person's job is, and got it in the news. And in the next 2 weeks, this was before the National Prayer Hour and some of the other stuff that happened. It became, that's sort of what GLAAD does. Like, that's our role. We're not human rights advocates. We are media advocates, but we had a role to play in that space. Now, as a signatory on a letter, as a group we do other work, we do anti-defamation work, and so it seems to me that there might be opportunities to partner. But I've certainly, and while we've asked some of those organizations to support our work, I don't know if we've ever been asked to support.
I'm not suggesting, Jarrett, it's you against that. I'm just saying.
No, and I'm not taking it. That's not how I'm taking it. Okay. I'm just saying I don't think that mainstream groups think to ask us, is what I'm saying.
Okay. Next question. I'm going to open it up for Ian. Go ahead.
Yeah, my original question actually changed building on this point, which is thinking about LGBT rights as a global issue, particularly listening to Jarrett, thinking about the fact, for example, It's not like American television programming or Hollywood is only seen in America. And to what degree, are there conversations going on about the fact that American cultural production changes the entire world? If we are going to be the center of if we're going to have this kind of America as the center of the world view, how can we use that to our advantage? There was this film the other night about LGBT rights and homophobia in the global South. And while leaving aside some issues after the film, basically sort of the importance of the internet, of Hollywood, of American cultural figures to developing a global language of LGBT identity, doesn't that charge our organizations with a certain level of responsibility to thinking about the global reach of our messages, not just what's happening in Capitol Hill, not just what's happening in state legislatures? And I open that up to everyone.
I'd like to just say something really fast on that, which is that I wouldn't just say it's sort of the production of sort of stuff, but also there's a certain pedigree internationally to American, those American products. I mean, quick story, we do these things called media awards at GLAAD, where we recognize the best in media in Spanish and in English. And we gave an award this year, just last week in Los Angeles, to a piece that Telemundo did, one of our Spanish language awards, on gay adoption. And it was a really great piece. But what amazed me was they got this award, and then on their Monday night national news broadcast, made it their lead story. That Telemundo got a GLAAD award, right? Like on Spanish language stuff. And it was because it was this American organization kind of with its imprimatur of quality journalism. It happened to be gay, right? But that was sort of secondary to how they covered the story. And they do battle with Univision about which one is a better network and whatever. And so they Univision got the award last year and put it on the news, right? We love that. We love that. But the point is, we do a lot of work with a company called Televisa, which is in Mexico City. About 70% of what you see on U.S. television in Spanish is made in Mexico City. But because the U.S. Spanish language market is a big part of that, our tastes, and a lot of people who are bilingual actually have helped influence getting gay characters on those Spanish language soap operas and other things. So there's a very important way in which our advocacy is part of it, but also our tastes are part of it because we're also consumers of that international stuff, or some of our culture is. Those who, in this case, those who speak Spanish are.
One more question. Do we have another question? Or we can just retire and go to the Malcolm Penthouse where there's a reception for everybody, free food and drinks. And thank you, all of you, for being here.